was I out here? A visit? Oh, did you go to the meeting? What?
Hi, good evening. It's Monday night, and if you're here, then you have joined us at the right time here because this is the CARES program. That's Communities and Relatives Empowered for Support. And we operate here out of Cornerstone Church, ATX, here in Lakeway, and we're very, very grateful for all of you who are here in person and for those of you who are joining us online. If this is your first time here, please know that the CARES program was designed with a very specific purpose. It was to build a community for those that have been touched by addiction. These are the family members, these are the parents, these are the siblings, and for tonight's topic, these are the children of those that are struggling in recovery. So our goal here is to create a space where you can have support, be able to hear from experts and have education, and also have resources provided to you. We want to create a safe environment where people can share and connect with one another. And to that, every Monday night, we gather around an expert speaker that shares. And tonight, I'm very happy to welcome a returning speaker, Professor Mayan Herman, who's been with us before. Professor Mayan Herman is a licensed clinical social worker and supervisor with great experience working in substance abuse treatment, a presenter who's presented at many conferences, and comes here sharing a lot of practice wisdom and practical experience and tools to help families there in recovery. So let's welcome Professor Mayan Herman.
Thank you.
Mayan, one of the things that we were really excited about having you here to talk about is we have had over a year's worth of speakers that have come up on this stage, and they've talked about everything from brain science of addiction to couples and relationship issues to advice on how to help your children, young and older, when we're dealing with boundaries. But we've never had a topic quite like the one we're about to talk about tonight, which is specifically what happens when you're the child of a parent who's going through addiction. So as a professional, how often do you see that dynamic?
A lot. Every single job I've had in social work, I've been working with kids who have lived with loved ones, parents, siblings with addiction. And and what we'll talk about today are there very specific traits that some children pick up because of those dynamics and how it impacts the whole family structure. So that's something I'll talk about today too.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll dive in right now. So
Cool.
when you talk about kids who have these kind of traits, what are some of those common things that you see in kiddos who have had parents with addiction?
A lot of traits I've seen, and this is not for everyone, but just really common traits are people pleasing traits. Having a parent or a loved one with an addiction has a huge impact on a kid's self-esteem, their identity. So that's something I'll talk about today in the presentation is identity gets impacted because so much of your energy goes into worrying for a parent or a sibling, worrying if they're going to come back, what's going to happen to them. And so you don't get a chance as a child to really develop and have that autonomy to develop that. So there's a lot of caregiving roles that you can take. We'll talk about different categories of roles that some children have. Some children end up becoming adults, like parentified kids at a really young age. Some kids take care of all their siblings and they take care of all the financial stuff. I've worked with a lot of kids who had to pay all the bills for their parents, start working at a young age. And then there's other kids that shut down, which is a neurological response and like a nervous system response. And they can just stay isolated. And it impacts their relationships growing up. It impacts your self-worth, your ability to communicate with other people. And it's chronic stress for kids to go through that.
So when you say about that chronic stress that these children, they spend a lifetime with their parents, right? Their early developmental formative years. So do they go through the same stages that everyone else goes through? And how is it different for them?
Yeah, childhood development is completely impacted. And not just with addiction. This could be a parent living with disabilities. It could be a parent that's not mobile. It could be in any situation, right? So what we'll talk about today can apply to any kind of family system that's impacted by mental illness, addiction, any kind of medical issues. But what happens is your stages of development, like for most of us, get impacted and sometimes stagnated. And sometimes you don't actually get to naturally enter a stage of childhood development, depending on what age you are, because you're taking on adult roles. and because of the anxiety and the worry about the family, and if whether they're going to stick together or not. So that's some of the other things I'll talk about too, is like those periods of your life where you're supposed to be having imagination, exploring, and playing. Some kids don't always get that, or they're doing it on their own. And so when I've worked with adults in therapy and in treatment centers, I've started to notice that that play side, that imagination inner child side never got activated. And so my experience working with elementary kids actually was really helpful in working with adults who are trying to get sober, because I realized like, wow, everything you do with kids, they need. They didn't have that playtime. They didn't have that time to like create. And if you are living with a lot of shame and guilt, or taking in your parents' shame and guilt, or apology, and then they go back to using, and then another apology, that kind of thing, you spend most of your time consumed by your energy is consumed by that person's life and whether they're going to come back or not. And you're always thinking about them, which makes it hard for you to stay present for other things, school, relationships, how you bond with other kids. It's different for all kids, though. I've seen all sorts of different kinds of reactions.
Well, and I like how you started talking about that anxiety that sometimes these kids feel because of the, I don't know if my parent is coming back. And, parents are supposed to be our anchor, our foundation. They're supposed to protect us. But when you have a child who's having to protect the family member, they tend to grow up pretty fast, right?
Yeah, very
So on the
fast.
outside, you see someone who's pretty functional, they're doing really well, they might be very mature. Oftentimes, it sounds like they get rewarded for being so good at taking care of stuff. Is that a bad
Yeah.
thing?
It is. And sometimes you'll get kids, and you've probably heard this before, you're so mature for your age. Like I remember working with a 7-year-old, and the teachers would always be saying, "Man, she's so mature and she's helping everyone." And I was thinking, I know this whole family history, and that was the thing in schools, is you always had to keep it confidential and stuff, but I'm like, I know what this kid's going through. Actually, the maturity is not great, right? In my mind, to me, it makes me sad, because I know she's taken on so many roles in the family, and she's taking care of her little 3-year-old sister. But the external environment validates it too, right? Like you were saying. So you're constantly getting people saying like, "Oh my God, you're behaving." We sometimes take childhood maturity and equate it with like if you're obeying an adult, right? Defiance versus obeying kind of thing. And I hate using the word defiance, but that's still used a lot in schools. So I've noticed that over time, which is confusing for a kid, because we're not really focusing on them as a person. We're focusing on if they're following the rules or not.
So the irony is that these kids who are behaving so well, they're being applauded for taking on tasks that normal kids wouldn't be doing, or not normal, but like kids, and
Hmm.
generally speaking, you would say they don't handle this, but they seem to jump into that. There's this kind
Yeah.
of reward. Is that a trauma response?
Definitely. It's definitely a trauma response, is fixing things. That's one of the roles that exists as like a family hero role we've heard before, or sometimes can be the same as chief enabler, which I know sounds kind of harsh, but what happens if the child in the family becomes a family hero, they're like the glue of the family. They neutralize, they step in during fights, they break up fights, they try to make everyone feel better. So as a kid, if you spend your whole life trying to make your parent feel better when they're down, or when they're not able to get, they're in a period where they're going through depressive, or they're anxious, that kid is the one who's their therapist most of the time. And so you spend all that time worrying, and then when you're in school, you might be spending all that time worrying about what mom or dad or sibling is doing. So it consumes so much of your energy. So then the part of the brain, that the frontal cortex, that's to do with emotional regulation, that kind of stuff, that gets thrown off. And also it can impact the amount of gray matter you have in your brain and your frontal cortex.
So walk me through that. When you say gray matter and impacting in brain development, what does that mean?
Yeah, so when we experience trauma, we can lose gray matter, and it can also grow back, which helps with like neuron connectivity, our cells understanding each other, connecting to our our neurotransmitters. And so when we experience like a traumatic brain injury or trauma in our childhood, or it can be a parent excessively screaming in your face, or any kind of physical sexual abuse, we can lose some of that brain mass, and our brain actually changes shape depending on that trauma, and it can be repaired. But because the brain can change shape, it's called brain plasticity, right? Like our brain is pretty much malleable, it changes over time. That frontal cortex, that ability to like regulate your emotions, to problem solve for yourself becomes a problem because you're always prioritizing someone else. So you could be like a fantastic problem solver, neutralizer for other people. Now I'm just talking about the field of social work
Yeah,
where we
yeah.
tend to go into it to fix our own problems, you know? But you can become excellent at helping someone else. And when it comes to taking care of yourself, it's really hard.
Wow. So you may see social workers, counselors, um, people in the medical field, people who just are naturally so good at helping others, and we have no idea that they're struggling
Yeah.
with trauma and all the anxieties and childhood traumas.
Mhm.
So, what happens when you see an adult after all these decades and they've functioned so well helping everyone else? Where are the signs where things start to break for them?
I've picked up on it's hard to unsee once you start studying it. So in social work we study internal family systems. Have y'all heard of that? Where you study like the hierarchy of the family, the structure of it. You study like the attachments, the relationships with mom and dad, siblings, everyone's role, like the roles we're talking about. Um, and I start picking up on it because I can see people's work ethic, right? So, like, as a social worker, when I see, and I've done it to myself, where you burn yourself out because you have very little compassion for yourself, but excessive amount of compassion for other people because that's what you're used to. So, that kid, that 8-year-old kid that is so mature for her age, I wonder about her as an adult because that's so much chronic stress. How is she going to have compassion for herself? So, those workers who are great at their job, they might not have any kindness for themselves. They might not, they have trouble with dopamine regulation. So that's another thing that gets impacted is ability to like feel satisfied by things.
Mhm.
So you might get your satisfaction or dopamine hit from helping others. And I've had the same issue where that was a lot of my identity was helping people until I had to step back and get my own help and realize, wow, that's not healthy though, if that is your entire identity.
Right, and you mentioned earlier too about self-esteem and how things are impacted and finding your worth around helping others,
Mhm.
but then missing that you are worthy of being helped as well.
Yeah.
So, when you talked about roles and that you have this hero that comes in, are there other roles that you see some of these adult children with parents of addiction?
Yeah, definitely. So there's also a lost child role we've probably heard of, where it's a child who isolates more, they keep to themselves, they shut down, they might be called weird, they might get made fun of by other kids, that they tend to be sometimes very artistic with and a huge imagination. Some of them end up being writers or, you know, that kind of thing I've noticed. But and then when they get older as adults, sometimes, and I don't want to stereotype, but sometimes a lost child, just because I've done couples therapy before, which is not always fun, but I've seen lost childs who end up married to family heroes because a family hero is so used to taking care of other people that when they form relationships, their body is still reacting as it did as a child. Even though you've developed and you have a different kind of brain and you've learned new things, your body still remembers those times where you were a helper. And so
Mhm.
you might still extend that helping in a romantic relationship and not even realize you're doing it. So a lost child, sometimes they feel out of control versus a family hero who might exert a lot of control because they had to be in control when they were younger. They didn't have a choice. A lost child can fall behind in school. Like maybe they need certain accommodations or services, but they kind of fly under the radar because they're so quiet because it looks like they're behaving, or it can look like they're not listening, right? And I've seen schools where they're like, that kid doesn't listen, he's defiant. I'm like, no, he's just going through a lot of stuff right now. He's really intelligent. It's just he's not going to learn the way you want him to, you know?
So when you work with communities, whether it's in spaces like churches, schools, different places, oftentimes people are saying, well, we wouldn't know how to recognize this. We would just see kids who are doing really well or highly functional, highly
Yeah.
successful. What would you say would be things that leaders in all these different community spaces should be looking for?
I definitely think looking for signs of overexertion, a lot of putting yourself down, like self deprecatory humor, which I'm guilty of. when it's in excess can sometimes be a sign. I know someone's joking around, but at the same time, that might be an accurate reflection of how they feel about themselves, and they're seeking some kind of connection or validation. There's a lot of lines I've heard everywhere I've worked where like, if I don't take care of it, no one will. It'll fall apart without me. That's really common. And I have to say that sometimes can be a red flag. Not maybe sometimes the truth. It will fall apart without you. But I've heard it so many times, and that's a trait too. You can say an adult child of alcoholic trait, and it doesn't just have to be alcoholism. It can be any kind of addiction to anything, not just substances. Will take that work ethic that they had as a kid and bring it into the workplace. And it actually can isolate you and affect your relationships of other people. And sometimes they tend to be managers of programs.
Okay.
Because they're so used to taking care of things.
I'm starting to feel guilty as a manager of this program, but actually,
Not everybody.
no, I think you're spot on. I mean, a bit of a disclosure, as the son of an alcoholic and recovering, everything that you're saying really connects well with me. And I think that there's a lot of people that are in this same space where they've just been experts because they've been doing this their whole lives, taking care of it. But it just having that moment of awareness of what you're doing has been helping everyone else, but what do you do to take care of yourself? So when you are, and we're going to open up in a minute here for Q&A. So if you're in the crowd, if you're listening to us, and then also if you're live, you can drop in questions here through the links, and also we'll have a microphone going around here. But the many roles that people take, and again, the rest of the world sees this as really successful, admirable tasks. Why do you, is this visible to most of the communities? We've got Alcoholics Anonymous, we've got Narcotics Anonymous, we've got recovery spaces, but is there a space for those children who don't have an addiction on the surface, but are struggling with all of the dynamics you're talking about?
Yeah, there's definitely different kinds of groups, and it depends on the person. Some people love the support group. Some people find it isolating. There's adult children of alcoholics, which can be really helpful, and there's a laundry list. I don't know if anyone's seen the laundry list before, but it's a list of traits that some children who have parents who are using are addicted to substances. Not even addiction. It could be like severe mental illness, right? Even a parent with untreated bipolar or schizophrenia. It could be the same thing. And so what happens, I just lost my train of thought, sorry. What we're talking about ACA. Yeah, so the laundry list, it can sound kind of harsh. I've had clients where I'm like, try out ACA, just see how it is so they can meet other people who have gone through similar things. Some people have loved it. Some people are like, this is really harsh. It's saying that you're the problem. And I've had clients who are like, I'm not the problem. My parent was the one. And I was like, but there are traits that you can become aware of that you're doing, some behaviors that are not actually helping you and might isolate you in your relationships. That shutting down your nervous system being activated, all of that can happen in a relationship. Being open to criticism or feedback, sometimes that feels like a complete attack on your personality. So in those groups, they talk about that laundry list, and then there's a flip side of the laundry list of what they're aiming for and healing those traits. There's also Al-Anon, which is highly effective when you work the 12 steps with a sponsor, which is for people who, like family members who are dealing with a loved one who's addicted. So you're not struggling with addiction yourself, someone else is. And there's also going to therapy, I have to say, with a therapist that is trained to treat addiction, because so many therapists don't know how to work with addiction. I can't even tell you how many social workers are like, I'm not touching this case. It's really true. Like, you would think as social workers, we know what we're doing, but we're not always specialized in addiction. Wow. And we don't have a mandatory class on it, right? It's an elective. Yeah. So that's what I've noticed in our field is we're really lacking.
Well, and that's a big part of why we bring speakers like you up here to share that. So if I may borrow your wisdom and training in working in the space of addiction as a therapist, what recommendations do you make for people who are now ready for therapy or want to start having that conversation? Where do they go? What should they be looking for in therapy?
Yeah, someone with an addiction background, any kind of addiction background will be helpful, because the problem is if a therapist doesn't know how to assess for addiction, they can misdiagnose sometimes. And if they don't understand adult trait of alcoholic traits, or they don't understand traits that you can pick up from living with addiction, then there's a lot they can miss, and they don't always understand where the anxiety is coming from. and you can't get to the root of the issue. So like I remember having a client who she would punish herself a lot and she would sometimes not eat and she would forget to meet her own needs because she was always worried about her mother growing up, that she'd in college forget to feed herself, or she would punish herself for certain things. And I realized that's on the ACA list, is those are a lot of traits, and her self-esteem was really low. And so we focused on the root of it. We connected her mom's alcoholism and how it impacted her relationship with her father, and how she didn't have a chance to grow self-compassion for herself and didn't have it for herself growing up because her mom didn't show it. We connected that with her current behavior in college and how it was impacting her grades. So you can kind of miss a huge root of the problem that way. Um, so
And when
I
you see
digress.
communities like this, I mean, what would you, as a therapist, having worked in these spaces, what would you want more communities to have ready or prepared? Interventions or supports, what would you say?
Yeah, I think I would love to see more of a combination of, even if you don't like 12 steps, like a variation of 12 step can be really effective with clinical. I don't always see, you see that dual diagnosis treatment in treatment centers, but to be honest, when you work in a treatment center, it can be pretty divided because you're working with recovery specialists and people who run AA meetings versus clinical, which can get too clinical.
Mm.
So I sometimes find on our side, we sometimes are isolating ourselves from being part of those communities. Yeah.
You shared a phrase, dual diagnosis. What does that mean? Impact that or unpack that for us.
Yeah, treating mental illness and addiction for the longest time, it was just treating addiction. You would go to treatment and they won't even talk about your mental health. And there's still places like that, but it's growing a lot now that there's dual diagnosis. But it's still a problem. If you don't have insurance and stuff, it's really hard to get both treated.
How when you spoke earlier about the person being a hero and taking care of others, and then saying to themselves like, "I'm not the problem, someone else is the problem," right? If they're so used to being the caretaker and identifying someone else, and for the first time they're seeing how they're part of this, I guess, equation or system of that, how how often do you see people like that actually connect with others and see others who are also struggling in the same space?
It's hard because you have to start it's almost like that first step in the 12 steps is you kind of have to like give up control for a little bit and understand that you don't know yourself completely and learn with someone. So it's a lot of letting go of control, which is really hard to do when you've grown up without any control or too little control, or you were the one in control and you were the one who's the parent. So having to be parented yourself and giving compassion is sometimes hard. It doesn't translate sometimes. And I've had clients who've gotten angry at me because I like praised them, complimented them, told them they were doing well, and they're like, "I don't like when you do that because I don't feel anything."
Mm.
And I'm like, "Well, I that makes sense though because your brain doesn't attach to things that you didn't grow up with as much. So if you didn't grow up with any compassion, or it was very up and down and dysregulated, and mom was here one day, the next day she was gone, or you never knew what the part boyfriend or girlfriend coming home, that kind of thing, or if you had to lock yourself in your room and stay there all night, that kind of dynamic, it's very hard for you to understand why you deserve compassion. And it's not something you can just tell someone through compliments. You have to help them like gain an identity and gain autonomy over their feelings and their thoughts, because those feelings and thoughts are so codependent with the person using. So you never get to have your own feelings and thoughts. I feel like I
So
digress, but
no, 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 no. This is
yeah.
this is perfect. I mean, and this is helpful because if someone's coming to you and says, "How can I tell if what I'm doing is helping versus controlling?
Mhm.
What's the difference?"
Yeah, the controlling, I'd say with the client, if you're working
Hmm.
with them, I'd say the number one thing is looking at all aspects of the person, because you always do a biopsychosocial. Let's look at your friendships, your relationship with your family, and often the relationships with the family are not great. There's like a lack of boundaries. Do you have any boundaries in your life? Usually there's not. Boundaries are very, on and off boundaries, inconsistent ones. Look at how you function at work, your work style, right? But you also always want to aim for what's most important to that person. You don't want to jump in with your own agenda and start pointing things out left and right. You want to focus on what that connects to that person the most in that moment and work from there. And then you want to gain trust. And also, what I've noticed is a lot of people just need help with basic sensory stimulation types of exercises, like grounding exercises, because a lot of kids who grow up with addiction in the household have PTSD and complex, like chronic PTSD. So, yeah,
When you say grounding exercises, what does that mean?
like learning about the brain a little bit and how to calm your five senses, which I know sounds really basic, but when you're dealing with that much trauma growing up, your senses can get really heightened and you can be very aware of what's going on, or you shut down. Or what happens too is that your dopamine and your oxytocin, we heard, like, your oxytocin is what keeps you close. That's like that intimacy love hormone, which can actually be good or bad. Studies have shown it's not always, yeah, if there's an excess of it. Your dopamine and your oxytocin um, can get dysregulated and reduce over time. Oh, we can't see it up here as much, but uh, and so it's hard for people to feel satisfaction in a relationship. They might be seeking other addictive kind of behaviors that don't have to be substance related. So there's always some kind of addictive behavior in there. But what the person is, you want to just teach them about how the brain functions. Like as a child, if there was a lot of chaos going on, the adults in the family, their frontal cortexes were probably shut down and they're in their feelings all the time, right? Or if you're using, then your behavior is erratic and it's all over the place, depending on what you're using. And so the kid learns how to overuse their frontal cortex and shut down the amygdala. And the amygdala is where you get all your emotions, your fear response. But when you become an adult, that amygdala is overactivated. And so you're very sensitive to certain things. So when I work with people, I wanted to explain that. I was like, let's learn about the brain too. People like learning about the brain. Let's learn about how the brain is and how you're responding. Because if I bring up a certain topic and they get defensive and angry, that's even something to point out, right? I noticed you had a response to that. What happened there? And people don't always know. They're like, no, I didn't. Like, well, I saw it. So I'm just giving you back an observation. So it's teaching you how your body's reacting to stimuli around you.
So grounding, you're retraining the body, you're retraining the brain to respond, to understand itself. And all these are really great strategies. And I'm going to put a scenario here for you, and we're going to start working the microphone around the crowd. So if you have a question, get ready, because we're going to open up the space here to move that around. And this is just the last question I'll ask on this. Hope. What message of hope could we share with people that might say, I have a friend, and I'm recognizing that pattern, and they seem to be so good at what they do, and now I'm starting to piece together there's a trauma response there. How do we approach that conversation with the people that we love around that might be overwhelmed with caring for a parent or, someone that's going through addiction?
Yeah, what I would keep in mind that the response you get might not be the response you want from that person if you're to address it. I would try to first understand what your relationship is like with that person and if they're in a place to hear you out. Because you have to build a certain kind of bond with that person to point things out, and not some people will take it as an attack. So it's a lot of describing what you're seeing, not your feelings, right? And there's something called Dearman in exercise. It's a DBT skill. Well, it's like, talk to the person about what you're seeing. Don't jump in with your emotions and being like, I feel like this when I see this. Tell them, like, I've noticed this is happening and I'm just wondering how you're doing. How are you taking care of yourself? Do you have time to take care of yourself? And then it really depends on what your goal is with the person. You have to first decide for yourself, like, what are you expecting out of this conversation? And do you think they're going to respond to what you're saying? Do you think they're going to be defensive? Because I think last time we talked about how when you get in a defensive mode, when someone points out, gives you feedback, right? You get stuck in your emotions and your nervous system reacts and could actually be reliving a time where you got criticized as a kid. So the severity of your reaction might not match up what's going on in real time. But your body's like, I remember that time when I was told I wasn't good at this, or I was told to shut up, that kind of thing.
So a lot of what you're sharing is having a genuine, authentic relationship with individual, and having that as an opportunity to be able to then talk about without any shame, without any judgment, observations, which is really great practical advice, especially when we're struggling to see how do we make that connection.
Yeah.
So we're going to segue here to questions in the audience
Yeah.
here, and just want to remind that again, part of the function of our Monday night series is to have a space here where there's community, so that you can connect with others, ask questions of experts, but also know that you're not alone in this process. So for anyone online, if you'd like to submit a question, we'll be reading through that. But in person, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll have that microphone come to you.
Thank you very much. What have you found to be effective in helping children in this situation from becoming addicts themselves?
Oh yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question. Um, it depends how much you're able to work with the family system. It's kind of tough because when I worked in a school, I only saw them in that school capacity, and you can't always bring the parents in and work with them. It's kind of hard because the parents were always working too, or had other stuff going on. But I'd say with it, you have to work with the whole family pretty much. So finding a trusted caregiver or a caregiver in the family who's somewhat healthy or is not using that can work with you, because without the family's buy-in, without communication with them, it's really hard to help the kid, because you can teach a kid so many different skills, but when they're back in that environment, the environment can be the number one thing feeding an addiction. So one thing you want to try to teach kids is starting with friendships too, is like, who are kids that actually make you feel good about yourself? Teaching them how to show themselves compassion, which could be kind of hard because some kids are like, the same thing. You compliment them and it doesn't mean anything to them because it's not coming from their parents. So they're not getting that biological connection. So it was a lot of self-compassion. It was a lot of regulating your body. And I think when you hit adolescence is when some of those addictive behaviors can come out a little bit more. And I feel like adolescence is also a really important part. But the tough thing is the environment, with that kid's going back to the same environment. So I'd say getting that kid involved in after-school activities, mentoring them, I remember in school there was a couple kids that were dealing with alcoholism at home, and I'd say to teachers I couldn't share anything, but I'd be like, this kid needs extra attention. Can we give them extra jobs and make them feel important? Can they start a club? So it's anything to boost their self-esteem. But that's always the hardest part, is when they return to the unhealthy caregiving that's going on. It's so hard to help. When a parent's involved and they're willing to go to treatment, it's a different story. And that can be easier to work with sometimes, depending. So it's self-esteem building. It's teaching them how their body functions. You can do neuroscience with kids, just like real basic, how the brain reacts, how the body reacts. Oh, when you got angry, what happened? Or who else have you seen get that angry before? Because I remember working with a third grader who he would erupt and he would tear down the entire classroom. I remember his teacher spent hours putting up all these, like, making it all fancy, and he ripped apart that entire classroom and destroyed everything she made. And when we would meet together, I'd be like, you are not the person, I've never seen you like that. You were a completely different person. It wasn't you. It was almost like someone was speaking through you. Do you remember what happened? And he's like, no, I kind of blocked it out, which makes me think there's so much going on at home, right, that he got overstimulated. So teaching a kid how to regulate is really helpful, because once they get overstimulated, anything could happen, right? Shut down, get violent, stop talking to people. That's a long answer. So I think starting with like regulation, self-compassion, and making them feel important. So another thing, sorry, one more thing, is positive reinforcement, is because sometimes the systems the kids are around, like in the school system, might not always be positively reinforcing the healthy behavior. Sometimes schools reinforce the stuff that's not great, like we were talking about, you're so mature, or calling kids defiant when they have ADHD, that kind of thing. So recognizing what they're doing well can help avoid like dopamine dysregulation as an adult. So having a kid be able to identify, oh, I did this today, even something really simple, like I opened the door and I didn't drop it out, like slam it shut on the kid behind me, or I passed, like in soccer, right? I passed the ball. So it's like very minor things, which is hard for teachers to do because there's so much, 30 kids in a classroom. So I'd say self-esteem, self-regulation, trying to work with the family as much as possible if you can. And when you're talking with the parents, not focusing on what's not working, but what is working, right? So yeah, there's so much that can go into that. I don't on forever.
Thank you. Thank you. We have the microphone going around. Another question.
I had a question for like adults or someone like who's a little bit older and maybe maybe even lost their parents or feel very disconnected from them, where the parents not and now they're on their own, kind of finding their way. How do you approach them in a way that's compassionate and kind of but like allows them to heal? Because it can be hard to find opportunities for them as an adult.
Yeah, I know, and the isolation piece can be so hard. I think it's getting to understand how they communicate and what their learning style is first. Because anytime I worked with a client and I noticed there were a lot of walls they had built, and you start building those walls as a kid, right? Because people break your trust all the time. So just thinking they might still really like you and be friends with you, but their trust is not always there, and it has nothing to do with you. It's just that there might be that fear in the back of their head that someone's going to abandon them. Because with addiction comes a lot of abandonment issues. It's different for everyone. So I think, what is their learning style? How do they connect? How do they communicate? Because it might not be verbal. It might be some other form of communication depending on your friend. I have no idea if it's a specific person. But how do they communicate with the world, and how do they perceive the world? So like start asking, planting little seeds, right? Because sometimes if you jump in too strong and you like try to make a connection, because I've made that mistake plenty of times with clients where I was like too excited to make a connection and they're like, whoa, you're not meeting me where I'm at. So trying to meet them where they're at, understanding their energy level. I know that's a lot of stuff, but just understanding, how do they learn in their job? How do they learn? With their favorite hobby, how do they connect with their favorite hobby? And sometimes it's like a little bit of dosing, little planting seeds. It's like you ask a little question that might be kind of personal, and then you pull back. Ask something small, pull back, change the subject, right? Because it might be too heavy. And then just get a glimpse of how they respond to that. Maybe they'll give you a little bit, maybe they'll push back. But that's even enough information for you, right? You see what happened.
Definitely.
So yeah, it is tricky because, right, you don't want to push people away.
And how do you get family members, or how would you go about getting a family to try to understand someone like that that's kind of like pushed them out or outcasted them in a way?
Yeah, I would be curious what the family is doing currently, because there might be things they're doing currently that are isolating. What are they saying? What is their perspective of the person? Right? Because I remember when I did like family sessions, I would be working with the client for a couple of weeks, and then family would come in, and well, it would make a lot of sense what was going on. And I could literally see like the addictive patterns in the family, even from everyone, siblings, grandparents. And the family's perception of the client was completely off. Like what the client was telling me in therapy every week, right? They were feeling like nobody loves them, nobody cares about them, they were abandoned. The family comes in and they're so fixated on that behavior, but maybe not ready to open it. Like the humble side is not ready to come out. Like, okay, our part. What was our part? So I would have a lot of parents who were like, you had everything you possibly wanted. Like you had all your needs met. How are you still blaming us? I'm like, well, there are some dynamics in the family we haven't talked about. Like, and getting that person a voice so they can open up and share it. I think a family, it's how are they speaking about their loved one? What is their goal too? What is their expectation? I think last time we talked, what are they expecting from their loved one as well? Because like, are those expectations reasonable? Because if that family is having unreasonable expectations about that person and they don't even know where that person's expectations are of their loved one, man, it clashes, and then it creates more distance. I don't know how often we really think about like, what is that person expecting from me? Or are they expecting, and like, I just remember so many times families coming in, there's that major disconnect. Families where it worked out is when they were listening. They didn't jump in. They weren't heightened. They were calmer. I've noticed families that are heightened with their own trauma or they have their own sensory reactions, it can escalate the other person. And then I would just see feuds, right? And people leaving the room and slamming the doors. So that's another thing for families is like, did you regulate yourself before you talk to this person? And do you know what your loved one's expectations are of themselves, how they feel about themselves? Because if that person's feeling really down on themselves and the family comes in strong, being like, we love you, we miss you, that can push someone. And it shows in a lot of relationships, right? Like that lost child dynamic. There's sometimes this thing called pursuer, chaser, or the person that, like, there's that one person that pursues the love a lot and the other person runs away. And then when the person's available, the other person's confused. Wait, what just happened? So they're replaying the dynamic with their parents. So I think families still do that sometimes. They're still replaying those childhood dynamics, and that just completely dysregulates the other person. So there's so much that goes into it. Okay, that was also a very long response too. But
No, this is great.
these are good questions.
Yeah.
You just have a lot of different responses.
We're going to have the microphone going around, and while the next person preps their question, I want to interject real quick. Are you too old to be considered a child of someone who's an alcoholic? Because sometimes you'll have children who are 40s, 50s, 60s. They have children, they have grandchildren, but this is the first time they ever considered the experience that they had with their parents decades ago. It seems like it's a lost identity at that point. So is it too late to address some of those issues?
Not at all. I've worked with people all ages. I had an 80-year-old client once that came in, and I started asking more questions. I had to pry a lot because generationally it's so interesting to see how people deal with mental health. I've seen like every generation's, like, not every, but I've seen a lot of ways that generations deal, right? Like younger generations are talking about mental health and they're using terms. And then and older generations, like silent generation, that kind of thing, baby boomers, minimize a lot of stuff because suffering was just like part of the deal. And so it's so internalized that sometimes I'd have to point out to like some folks, it sounds like your dad was an alcoholic. And they're like, no, he wasn't. Well, you said every time you came home he was drinking. Yeah, but he had like 3 beers. And I'm like, okay, well, how did he behave? Like, was his behavior impacted? And some people didn't even quite put the words to it. My parent was an alcoholic. And I've had clients where we start working through the ACA list or however they want to learn, and they're shocked. Yeah. They're like, there's no way this still impacts me. I'm like, it very much does because you've never talked about it. You just shut that part of your brain off for so long. But it's manifested as chronic stress. It could even manifest into an autoimmune disorder. I mean, there's so many ways it can manifest. So it's never too late to have this discussion. And that's why ACA is open to, I don't think it's open to all ages, but there's a certain age limit, probably 18 and up.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with good reason, I guess, 18.
Yeah, because the subject matter is tough, yeah.
But, kind of coinciding with the question earlier too, how do you address this? How do you prevent, working with children? You've given us a great game plan of how to work with kids, how to connect them with that, as well as resources for adults moving forward. And I want to leave space for one more question. If there's one more question out there in the crowd, if you're holding on to that, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get that microphone moving over to you.
I had a question about like dual diagnosis again, like so someone who is maybe struggling with addiction but also has a dual diagnosis, and you said it's really tough without insurance or maybe even a place to live. So like, have you ever worked with someone who's homeless or about to be or something like that, and also struggling with addiction?
Yeah, that's a good question because that's the reality for most people. Is like most people can't afford treatment. And even if you can afford treatment, the relapse rates are pretty high, right? So treatment's not going to fix you. It can help. But also there's some ethics with some treatment centers too that I've dealt with working at them. So I've also worked with people, like you were saying, unhoused who have no insurance. And at that point, it's like safety. Like first of all, establishing some kind of safe place and talking to them about their environment. And sometimes that's impossible to have a safe environment if you're living on the streets, right? And right now, housing in Austin is, like resources for the unhoused are limited right now. There's like nowhere for people to go, so that's tough. So it's what's free, what's affordable. Getting into, I know some people are really reluctant to get to an AA meeting, so I talk about all the different kind of recovery meetings there's like smart recovery, there's communities in recovery, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of other options out there that's not just AA. But like try one meeting and see who you meet, right? And you don't even have to say anything. You can just sit there and listen. Or try to go every single day. because if you're out of a job right now, you got time on your hands. So fill it up with meetings and see where you feel like you fit in. Because some people don't feel like they fit in at certain AA meetings or other spots. And then there's also numbers you can call. Like there's a number called OSAR. It's a screening number where they try to find affordable treatment, and you usually have to leave town. Like that's the reality right now in Austin. Like a lot of people just have to leave and go to San Antonio, Dallas. I don't know if Houston has many options. And that is the reality, is that we just are lacking treatment centers in general. I think what people need the most is a community. Anything, a sober community. And that could be anywhere they feel comfortable. That's like a safe place. That's a tough one though, right? Trying to stay sober when you're living on the streets or you're constantly working. I think I've also worked with people that were struggling financially and they're working like 3 different jobs. Like, how do you fit time in for that? And we kind of talked about if you really want to get better, you'll find it, because those meetings are all day online. So letting people know they're accessible. They're online. I would used to print out those sheets like, look, you've got one at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, every part of town. So just offering the resources. I forget your question. I don't even know what I'm answering now.
Renee, one quick bolt-on. I'm afraid I know the answer, but you just barely touched on something at the end of an answer a while ago about schools and teachers. So if you've got a kid, maybe both parents are struggling with addiction, maybe one is and the other is maybe the weaker parent and just not knowing what to do themselves. So you got a kid in elementary or junior high or even going into high school. Do we even come close through our school systems of doing anything to see some or any of these things that you're describing where a teacher would maybe catch that or say something or bring it to someone's attention without the child saying, hey, I need help, which is probably not going to happen?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I've worked with some teachers who are fantastic and others that are so overwhelmed that they don't see anything going on. It also depends on the kind of teacher and the training they have. Like, I know some schools are moving towards more trauma-informed stuff, but it depends on what's offered. We know sometimes of schools, there's not a lot of resources depending on geographic location. But I do think if you have some kind of mentor, if you have teachers that recognize something's wrong and they know the signs, like grades dropping, that kind of thing, zoning out, missing a lot of class, that is a good time to step in and see whatever you can do to connect with that kid. And yeah, you're right. That might be the best way to make a connection. Because when I worked with a lot of people who either had addiction in their family or were recovering from it, they remember those people forever. They remember their mentors and stuff. So yeah, you're right. Like, and sometimes it's hard for a kid to get a solid mentor. I think we don't often use kids as mentors for other kids. That's underutilized. Like the school I worked at, we had a lot of middle and high schoolers that had truancy issues. We decided to pair them with elementary, like kids who were struggling at home. And those kids actually started coming to school because they felt useful and they actually really liked giving advice. Maybe everything was going wrong at school for them, but they loved it. And they actually would come back, and some of their attendance, maybe grades didn't improve, but attendance improved. So I think there's a lot schools could be doing, but they don't, unfortunately, those mentor programs. I wish we had more mentor programs, because you bring up a really solid point.
Do we have time for one more?
Yes, yes.
And so, boy, we could hop on the educational model for hours, I'm assuming, only because, right? I mean, so you're bringing up so many good points, and some of the solutions that you sort of touched on here are the economics of are non-existent, right? So they're basically, you're talking about changing bringing the high school kids in and giving them something to do and giving them responsibility, making them feel useful, that kind of stuff, working with how much does that cost? Absolutely nothing, other than just establishing the programs. Done with that conversation. So then, though, you keep bringing up mental health and addiction. Are they mutually exclusive as far as insurance companies are concerned? I don't understand why they only deal with the addiction and not the mental, or vice versa if that's the case. Why is it mutually exclusive? I don't understand the insurance conversation there.
Yeah, that always gets messy. So there's a lot of places now are dual diagnosis, so they treat both. So they see it as like comorbidities. They see it together now. So, but for the longest time, like people would get their treatment at hospitals, and there was this medical model that they like sometimes called the bio model because it was just not looking at the whole person. Insurance will cover dual diagnosis. It's just a matter of getting a clinician that knows how to treat it. Because you can get a really fantastic clinician and get your mental health treated, but like if they don't know the signs of addiction or the traits or like some of the internal family systems, you're not getting that kind of care. So that's the hard part, is trying to find a therapist who can meet those needs. And when you're in a treatment center, they have therapists on staff and they have clinical groups and everything. It's just a matter of getting access to that after, right? Because then there's outpatient, there's partial hospitalization. It's so much money. So I think that there's a massive gap right now in disparity, and who can afford treatment and and the quality of care people get is drastically disparate. Yeah.
So how close are we? So if I end up with cancer, I get a team,
Yeah.
right? So whenever I go in, I've got half a dozen people that are dealing with all kinds of esoteric symptoms and things like that on the surface appear disconnected, but they're biologically, through miracle of medicine technology, directly connected. How close are we to establishing the team concept for this type of illness model, recovery model, joined together model?
I don't think we do a good job at all of it, because that's what's needed, is a team model. Like you said, with cancer, you have a lot of different doctors and they're communicating with each other, or you hope so, right? So the medical model seems to work in a team, but then and then sometimes a social worker comes into play and they're part of that team process too. With addiction, I don't see that often, just because there are so many medical professionals that don't know how to treat it, and it's also stigmatized for medical professionals, right? Like they have to report stuff to the medical board when they are practicing. So I've noticed that gets stigmatized on a medical level. It kind of bleeds into how they treat their patients. So I wish there's more of that model. Like even when I worked at a health clinic, we had substance use services, there was therapy, medical, and we didn't work hand in hand. There was so much miscommunication. So that's the issue, is we don't have that integrated health model. Like sometimes we see that places, but for addiction, I don't see that often. I don't know if you do, but
Yeah, I'm thinking of like eating disorder clinics
yeah,
where they use DBT, and then they'll
yeah,
have nursing, they'll have a lot of different disciplines that are involved in there.
exactly.
But you're right, with addiction, it takes a very special place where they start looking at all sorts of facets. So the licensed chemical dependency counselor,
Mhm.
the licensed marriage and family therapist,
Yeah.
relation, all of that. But you're right, it's not as wide or common just yet.
I know, and that's a good point. It's a shame though, because that's very successful. Like you said,
Mhm.
and also you have to be able to afford eating recovery treatment. But even
Right.
when going to treatment, it can be highly effective, like eating recovery center, because yeah, they do have that. You're right. They have that model where they're meeting with different providers and they all communicate. You want your psychiatrist, you want your therapist, you want your doctor to all be communicating. And often as social workers, we're the ones trying to bridge that communication gap. We're the ones
Mm.
calling everyone, getting releases of information, trying to. And it's always was a red flag to me when a doctor, you would call them up, or a psychiatrist, and they didn't really want to hear from you,
Mm.
which is sometimes the case. It's like, this is my client. I treat my client. I do this. I do medication. You do that. But I'm like, no, actually, we can work. So I see a lot of siloing. Like I see a lot of professions that could work together beautifully that don't. I think it's also we just don't have enough integrated health models in how we teach. It's not in education as much. I'm not seeing it that much. Like the fact that we don't have it in social work,
Mhm.
we have integrated health models that talk about mental health, but with addiction, I don't think as much.
So, Mayan, this is your second time with us, and I think we're leaving this right here at a cliffhanger moment where I think we've already built now the topic for our third invitation for you. So, I hope you'd be willing to come back and join us because this has been amazing. I mean, I'm looking at the clock. 54 minutes just went by so fast
Yeah.
because we have had so much content in here. And I'd love to remind people, both here in person and online, that this is the purpose of Monday nights, is that we're able to answer questions here from the audience, to share information that may be new or familiar, but with different contexts and the capacity to be able to ask those questions. So again, a CARES program is set up to provide community, to provide resources and to provide support. And so much of what you shared today, Mayan, talked about the importance of relationship building. So if you're in the Lakeway area, we just want to encourage you to come visit us here on Monday nights. Next Monday, we will have Drew Dutton, who comes from Phoenix House. He's been a guest with us before as well. He talks about brain science and the impact on the family, so he'll be returning here. But the whole point is that we want to make sure that this is a safe, confidential space for you to gather information, connect, and if you are here live, the bonus is you get to stick around and ask questions off camera. So we're going to go ahead and end the live streaming portion, but for those of you here in person, if you have questions, Mayan will be available here. Mayan, thank you again for coming and sharing so much with us, and we all grow and benefit from that. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. I love talking about this.
Got it. And if you missed anything here, don't worry, we're going to have this posted on YouTube. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I'm missing one, YouTube. So we're on social media. Please like. If you enjoyed this time, please consider subscribing so that you don't miss any announcements. Feel free to share. We also, throughout the week, also put out content. So you're going to see bite-sized moments from tonight that you can easily share with other friends or family members and spread the word of what's happening here. And also the resources that you heard, we'll have them listed and available so that you can come back to that in a summarized format. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Mayan, thank you one more time. And as we say every week when we wrap up, this is your first time here, whether online or in person, we have one simple message for you. Welcome home. Thanks for being here with us, and we look forward to seeing you next Monday. Have a good night.
Good job.